The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as young musicians from all over the city gathered for the annual youth talent competition. Backstage, a small black girl tuned her violin, her fingers moving carefully over the strings. She was the last performer, and the judges had already seen dozens of talented kids play that day. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage, her heart pounding. The judges glanced at her, their expressions indifferent. One of them, a strict-looking man with glasses, leaned back in his chair as if he'd already made up his mind. Another judge, a woman with sharp features, barely looked up from her notes. The girl took a deep breath and raised her violin. The moment her bow touched the strings, something magical happened. The first note rang out, clear, powerful, and full of emotion. The judges froze. The audience fell silent. It was as if time had stopped. Her fingers flew across the strings, weaving a melody so beautiful that it sent chills down everyone's spine. The music was alive, it told a story of struggle, hope, and triumph. The judge's eyes widened in shock. The man with glasses sat up straight, his earlier doubt replaced by awe. The woman who had barely paid attention now stared, completely captivated. By the time she finished, the entire room was on their feet, clapping wildly. The judges looked at each other, realizing just how wrong they had been. This was no ordinary girl. This was a prodigy. And they had almost underestimated her. The applause thundered through the auditorium, but the girl barely heard it. Her heart was still racing from the performance. The judges, who had seemed so uninterested before, were now staring at her with wide eyes. The man with glasses leaned forward, his earlier skepticism gone. "That was unlike anything we've heard today," he said, his voice quieter now, almost in awe. The girl gripped her violin a little tighter, her fingers still tingling from the last note. She hadn't expected this reaction. Most people didn't take her seriously when they first saw her, a small black girl with an old violin. But music was the one thing that never judged her. The female judge, who had barely glanced up earlier, now had tears in her eyes. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. The girl hesitated. The truth wasn't glamorous. She grew up in a tiny apartment with her grandmother, who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. There was never extra money for luxuries like music lessons. But one day, her grandmother came home with a beat-up violin she'd found at a thrift store. It was missing a string, the wood was scratched, and the bow was frayed, but to the girl, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She taught herself by watching free videos online, practicing in the hallway of their building when the neighbors weren't home. Some nights, she played until her fingers ached. Other kids in the neighborhood teased her, saying she'd never be good enough. But her grandmother always told her, if you love something, you don't give up on it. As she shared pieces of her story, the room fell silent. The judges exchanged glances. They had expected polished performers from elite music schools, not a self-taught prodigy who played with more soul than any trained musician they'd heard. The third judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face, finally spoke. "Do you know how rare your talent is?" he asked. "You don't just play the notes, you make them feel." The girl blinked, surprised. No one had ever put it that way before. To her, music wasn't just about hitting the right notes, it was about telling a story. Just as the judges were about to announce their decision, the competition organizer rushed onto the stage, whispering something to them. Their expressions changed. The female judge turned to the girl. "There's been a small issue," she said carefully. "Some of the other contestants' parents are questioning the fairness of the competition." The girl's stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. They didn't believe she could really be that good. The strict judge sighed, rubbing his temples. Then he stood up and faced the audience. "Since there are concerns, we'll do something unusual," he announced. "We'll have her play again, right now, with a completely new piece." No preparation. Let's see if she's truly as talented as we think. The crowd murmured in surprise. The girl's hands trembled. This was a test, one she hadn't prepared for. But then she remembered her grandmother's words, when people doubt you, that's when you play your loudest. She took a deep breath, raised her violin, and closed her eyes. And then, she began to play. The air in the auditorium grew thick with tension as the girl steadied her violin under her chin. A challenge, no sheet music, no preparation, just raw skill. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard whispers. No way she can pull this off. But she had spent years playing in the dim light of her apartment, turning frustration into melody. She didn't need sheet music. The music lived inside her. She drew her bow across the strings, and this time, she chose Winter from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, a piece so difficult that even seasoned musicians struggled with its sharp, icy runs. The first notes burst forth like a snowstorm, fierce, unpredictable, breathtaking. Her fingers danced across the strings, never missing a step. The music painted pictures, wind howling through bare trees, frost creeping over windows, the quiet hush of a world frozen in time. The judges' pens froze mid-air. The skeptical parents in the audience leaned forward, their earlier smirks fading. One man, who had been loudly complaining about favoritism, slowly closed his mouth. Backstage, the other contestants watched in stunned silence. A boy who had earlier bragged about his private tutor whispered, "She's not even looking at the strings." As the final note faded, the room erupted. Not just applause, cheers, whistles, people standing so fast their chairs clattered. The strict judge removed his glasses, wiping his eyes hastily. The female judge was on her feet, clapping so hard her hands turned red. But the biggest surprise came from the competition organizer, who rushed back on stage with a phone pressed to his ear. Maestro Romano heard the live stream, he blurted. "He wants to speak with her now." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Maestro Romano wasn't just a famous violinist, he was a legend, known for discovering once-in-a-generation talent. The girl's hands shook as she took the phone. A deep, accented voice boomed through the speaker, "Child, who taught you to play like that?" Her answer was simple. "No one, sir. I just listened." A pause. Then the maestro's reply sent chills down every spine in the room, "Then the world should hear you." The auditorium lights felt hotter now, the air buzzing with murmurs as the girl stood frozen, the maestro's words still ringing in her ears. "The world should hear you." Her fingers clutched the phone tighter, her knuckles turning pale. Around her, the judges exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the competition script. The organizer, a nervous man with a headset, stepped forward. "Maestro Romano has invited you to perform as a guest soloist with the National Symphony next month," he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "He's insisting." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The National Symphony was the kind of stage most musicians spent their whole lives dreaming of, and she was being offered it at her age, with no formal training. But not everyone was celebrating. Near the front row, a well-dressed woman, the mother of another contestant, stood abruptly, her designer purse hitting the seat with a sharp thwack. "This is absurd," she hissed, just loud enough for others to hear. "She's clearly had professional coaching. No child learns Vivaldi in a vacuum." A murmur of agreement rippled through a section of the audience. A judge shifted uncomfortably. The girl felt her chest tighten. She knew that tone, the same one neighbors used when they'd ask her grandmother, "You really think she'll amount to anything with that toy violin?" The strict judge, perhaps sensing disaster, intervened. "Young lady," he said gently, "would you show us your violin?" She hesitated, then held it out. The instrument told its own story, the mismatched strings, the deep scratch along the belly where she'd repaired it with school glue, the faded sticker of a cartoon character near the chin rest, a gift from her little cousin. The female judge ran a finger along the worn fingerboard. No professional musician would play on this, she murmured. It's practically unplayable. A hush fell. The well-dressed woman sat down abruptly. Maestro Romano's voice crackled through the phone again. Well? Do I send a car or not? The girl looked out at the sea of faces, some odd, some jealous, some still doubtful. Then her gaze landed on her grandmother, standing in the back in her faded work uniform, hands clasped over her mouth. That's when she realized, this wasn't just about music anymore. Sir, she said softly into the phone, can my grandma come too? The maestro's laughter boomed through the speakers. Darling, she can have my front row seat. As the crowd finally erupted into cheers, backstage turned chaotic. A reporter shoved a microphone toward her. How does it feel to be called a genius? Before she could answer, a boy in a tailored suit, the competition's previous favorite, shouldered past, knocking her music stand over with a loud clatter. Enjoy it while it lasts, he muttered. They'll forget you by next week. His parents hurried him away, but the damage was done. The girl bent to pick up the stand, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Some people only hear the noise, not the music. She didn't need them to. The real symphony was just beginning. The car sent by Maestro Romano smelled like leather and old books. The girl pressed her face against the window as skyscrapers blurred past, her grandmother squeezing her hand so tight it almost hurt. You nervous? Her grandma asked. She nodded, unable to speak. The invitation had felt like a dream until now, but the imposing glass and steel concert hall looming ahead made it terrifyingly real. Backstage at the National Symphony, no one clapped. 30 professional musicians, many twice her age or more, glanced up from tuning their instruments as she entered. A cellist snorted. They really meant child prodigy, he muttered. The concertmaster, a severe woman with silver streaks in her hair, didn't even look up from her sheet music. Maestro Romano, a bear of a man with wild white hair, broke the tension by clapping his hands. Listen up. Today we meet the future. He gestured to the girl. She'll be soloing with us next month. A violinist in the front row raised an eyebrow. And her credentials are. The girl's stomach dropped. She had no conservatory diplomas, no competition trophies, just the violin in her hands and the fire in her chest. The maestro grinned like he'd been waiting for this. Let's find out. Page 87, Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, Third Movement. Murmurs erupted. The piece was a notorious finger twister, one that made even seasoned soloists sweat. The concertmaster finally looked up, smirking. Good luck keeping up, kid. The girl's palms slicked with sweat as she took her place at the front. The orchestra began without her, a whirlwind of strings and pounding timpani. For 3 brutal measures, she stood frozen. Then her bow touched the strings. At first, she matched them note for note, careful and precise. But as the tempo skyrocketed, something snapped inside her. This wasn't about proving herself anymore, it was about surviving. Her playing turned fierce, raw. She attacked the spiccato passages like they'd wronged her, her bow bouncing so fast it blurred. When the orchestra faltered at a particularly gnarly transition, she didn't, she leaned into the discord, twisting it into something hauntingly beautiful. By the final cadenza, the cellist who'd mocked her had stopped playing entirely, his mouth slightly open. After the last note, the silence was thicker than the one in the competition hall. Then the concertmaster did something no one expected, she stood. Where did you learn to phrase like that? She demanded. The girl wiped her brow. My apartment's kinda near the subway. I used to play along with the trains screeching. A beat. Then the concertmaster burst out laughing. God help us all. Romano, she's better than you said. The maestro winked. Told you. As the orchestra dispersed for break, the girl finally exhaled. Her grandmother, watching from the wings, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. But the triumph was short-lived. Across the room, the principal violist, a man with cold eyes, was whispering to a group of musicians. They kept glancing her way. One phrase carried clearly across the space: "Won't last once the press gets involved." The girl tightened her grip on her bow. She'd earned her place today. Now she had to keep it. The rehearsal room emptied as musicians packed up their instruments, but the girl lingered, running her fingers over the sheet music one last time. The Tchaikovsky concerto still hummed in her bones. She barely noticed when the principal violist, the cold-eyed man from earlier, paused beside her chair. "Impressive, for an amateur," he said, placing a steaming cup of tea dangerously close to her sheet music. "Shame about the unfortunate incident at your last school." Her head snapped up. "What?" But he was already walking away, whistling. The next morning, her grandmother's old flip phone buzzed non-stop. A text from the competition organizer: "Check the news." The local paper's headline screamed, "Prodigy or pretender?" Questions swirl around young violinist's past. Below it, a blurry photo of her being escorted out of middle school by a security guard, the day she'd gotten into a fight after kids smashed her lunchbox with her only practice violin inside. The article called it a pattern of instability. Worse yet, the comments section was a war zone. No way she learned without teachers, probably stole someone else's talent. They always push diversity hires these days. Her grandmother snatched the phone away. "Devils," she muttered. "They can't stand seeing you shine." By noon, Maestro Romano stormed into the symphony office, his voice shaking the windows. "You will not revoke that child's invitation." The board president, a slick-haired man in a too-tight suit, sighed. "Antonio, be reasonable. The donors are nervous." That incident. Was a child defending herself? The maestro slammed his fist on the desk. A pencil holder toppled. "I heard her play. You think that comes from anything but pure, raw genius?" A silence. Then the board president leaned back. "Fine. But if she cracks under pressure at the gala, it's your reputation too." The girl arrived early for her next rehearsal, only to find her violin case already open. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong, until she lifted the instrument. The bridge was bent at a sickening angle. The hair on her bow had been sliced nearly clean through. Her breath came in short gasps. This wasn't wear and tear. This was murder. "Need a spare?" She whirled around. The concertmaster stood in the doorway, holding out her own priceless Stradivarius. "It's tuned to your preference," she said casually, as if offering a cup of sugar. The girl's hands trembled. "I can't, this is worth more than my. And right now, so are you." The older woman's eyes hardened. "Someone wants you to fail. Play anyway." That night's run-through was electric. With the lone Strad singing under her fingers, the girl attacked the music with a new ferocity, not just technically perfect, but angry. Every note was a rebuttal, every phrase a challenge. When she hit the concerto's infamous double stops, the brass section actually cheered. Afterward, even the skeptical musicians gave reluctant nods. The principal violist was conspicuously absent. But as she packed up, a stagehand slipped her a note. "The gala crowd won't be as kind. Quit now and save yourself the humiliation." The girl crumpled it, her jaw set. They didn't understand. She'd spent her whole life playing broken instruments. What was one more attempt to silence her? The night of the gala arrived with a thunderstorm. Backstage at the concert hall, the girl peeked through the curtains at the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos. Critics sat with pens poised. Cameras lined the aisles. In the front row, her grandmother clutched a damp handkerchief, her Sunday church dress neatly pressed for the first time in years. Then she saw him, the principal violist, smirking as he tuned his instrument. Their eyes met. He made a subtle slicing motion across his throat. The borrowed Stradivarius felt suddenly heavy in her hands. 5 minutes to places, a stagehand called. The girl jumped and Maestro Romano appeared beside her, his usual boisterous energy replaced by quiet intensity. Listen carefully, he murmured. They're waiting for you to fail. So give them something else to remember. Before she could respond, the concertmaster materialized on her other side, adjusting the girl's collar with surprising tenderness. And for God's sake, breathe between phrases. You play like someone's chasing you. The girl opened her mouth, to thank them. To confess her terror, but the lights dimmed. Showtime. The opening orchestral swell usually signaled her entrance, but tonight, something was off. The violins sounded thin. The tempo dragged. Then she realized, they were testing her. Seeing if she'd panic when thrown off balance. She closed her eyes. And listened. When her solo came, she didn't play the written notes. Instead, she spun the melody into something wilder, improvisation that wove through the orchestra's hesitation like a bird dodging storm winds. The musicians blinked at their stands. The maestro's baton faltered. Then, miraculously, the cellos answered her, deepening the harmony. The woodwinds joined. By the time she circled back to Tchaikovsky's original score, the entire ensemble was following her lead. Midway through the cadenza, a snap echoed through the hall, her E-string breaking under the strain. The audience gasped. The principal violist's smile turned vicious. But the girl didn't stop. She transposed the remaining passages on the fly, shifting every note to the 3 intact strings without missing a beat. The broken strand whipped against her cheek like a tiny lash, but she played harder, turning the accident into defiance. Backstage, the concertmaster was already moving, grabbing the violist's arm as he tried to slip away. You filthy coward. The music drowned her out. As the final note hung in the air, the silence lasted 1 heartbeat. 2. Then the audience erupted. Men in tuxedos stood cheering. Women wiped their eyes. The newspaper critic who'd written the hit piece was clapping so hard his program tore. But the girl only had eyes for the figure now pushing through the crowd, a gray-haired man in a wheelchair, his hands trembling as he reached for her. Papa? Maestro Romano choked out. The old man ignored his famous son, grasping the girl's wrists instead. You play, he whispered in a thick Russian accent, exactly like my teacher did in Leningrad. Like your soul is on fire. He turned to the stunned audience. This is what real music sounds like. 3 months later, the girl walked onto a different stage, this time with a custom-made violin gifted by the maestro's father. The principal violist had been quietly dismissed. The newspaper issued a retraction. As she tuned, a little boy in the front row tugged his mother's sleeve. Mama, she's just like me. He held up a battered ukulele with missing strings. The girl smiled and adjusted the microphone. This one's for anyone who's ever been told their instrument isn't good enough, she said. Then she played, not perfectly, but fearlessly. And somewhere in the wings, the concertmaster and Maestro Romano shared a satisfied nod. Some prodigies are born. Others fight their way into being.